June 1942. Across the dusty testing grounds of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, a new American tank rolled into view. It was squat, box-shaped, and built for production rather than elegance. Officially, it was the medium tank M4, but the troops who would ride in it soon gave it a name that would echo across two oceans, the Sherman. The Sherman was never designed to be a monster. When U.S. planners approved it in 1941, the expectation was for a fast, reliable, medium vehicle to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. At that time, American intelligence still believed German armor to consist mainly of Panzer III and IVs armed with short-barreled guns. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, a descendant of the French 1897 field piece, was considered sufficient for the task. What the designers did achieve was a masterpiece of standardization. The M4 shared parts across multiple factories, its radial aircraft engine could be replaced by Ford or diesel units, and its vertical volute suspension could be serviced in the field with basic tools. Crews could fix nearly anything with a wrench and a welding torch. It was not elegant, but it worked, and it could be built by the tens of thousands. By late 1942, Shermans landed in North Africa with the U.S. II Corps. At Kasserine Pass in early 1943, they met German Panzers for the first time. The results were mixed. Against early Panzer IIIs and short-barreled IVs, the Sherman performed well. Its gyrostabilized 75mm gun allowed quicker target reacquisition on the move, a feature unique at the time. But reports from the front revealed growing trouble. German tanks were rapidly upgrading. When Operation Citadel erupted at Kursk in July 1943, Allied observers noted the debut of the Panther Ausf D, sporting a long 75mm KWK-42/70 gun capable of piercing 120mm of armor at a kilometer. Around the same period, the fearsome Tiger I began to appear in Tunisia and Sicily. Suddenly, the 51mm frontal armor of a Sherman looked paper-thin. In Britain, commanders such as Major General Hobart and Brigadier George Unwin warned that existing Allied tanks would be outranged and outshot. American ordnance officers agreed, but mass production was already committed. Stopping the lines to redesign the tank would delay invasions by months. The answer from Washington was pragmatic: quantity over quality. By late 1944, American factories were producing over 2,000 Shermans per month. The logic was simple. No single tank had to be the best if there were always 5 more behind it. Still, for the men who fought inside them, that arithmetic was cold comfort. Spring 1944, southern England. As crews trained for the upcoming invasion of Normandy, they began hearing grim intelligence about German defenses in France. Entrenched Panthers and Tigers, concealed in hedgerows, waiting to fire from ambush. Gunners practiced range estimation endlessly. A Sherman could rarely penetrate a Panther's glacis even at 300 yards. To win, they would have to flank it, aim at the sides, and coordinate fire. Here, the Sherman's strengths quietly emerged. Its two-way radio in every tank, something German formations often lacked, allowed rapid communication between platoons. Its 3-man turret freed the commander to observe instead of loading shells. Its hydraulic traverse let the gun swing quickly toward new threats. None of these advantages mattered if a single shot destroyed the tack before it could respond, but it gave crews options. The U.S. Army began teaching a doctrine called maneuver en masse. Rather than single tank duels, Shermans would fight in platoons of 5, attacking from multiple angles, using smoke and coordination to overwhelm heavier enemies. To make that possible, gunners had to judge distance fast and fire almost simultaneously. The problem was that the Sherman lacked an optical rangefinder. Crews estimated range by experience or by counting the seconds between muzzle flash and shell impact. Against a Panther with a sophisticated stereoscopic rangefinder, those seconds could be fatal. It was in these training fields, and later in the hedgerows of Normandy, that the so-called mirror trick was born. Some historians trace its origin to a British instructor at Lulworth Camp in 1944, who demonstrated a simple parallax method using two mirrors mounted at fixed angles on the commander's periscope. Others credit American ordnance officers experimenting with optical range estimation devices. Whatever its birthplace, the principle was simple enough for any crew to build in the field. A small V-shaped arrangement of mirrors was fixed inside the periscope. By slightly offsetting one mirror, the commander saw two images of the target. As the tank moved or as he adjusted the mirror angle, the two images would converge into one at a known distance. By calibrating this convergence against pre-measured ranges, he could estimate how far the target stood. The method required no new parts, no electricity, and almost no training. To modernize, it looked almost ridiculous, a dumb mirror trick, as one veteran later called it. But it worked. Crews discovered they could judge range within 50 yards at up to a kilometer, far better than guessing. When used by an entire platoon, it allowed multiple tanks to sight and fire in concert, concentrating their 75mm guns on a single enemy. The first battlefield use appears in records from June 1944 during the fighting near Saint-Lô in Normandy. A platoon from the 2nd Armored Division reported destroying 2 Panthers with coordinated fire after sighting range with mirror device on commander's scope. The report reached higher headquarters, and field workshops began installing similar setups on replacement periscopes. At this stage, the mirror was only part of a larger evolution. Crews also learned to use the Sherman's high turret traverse and excellent optics to fire first, often the decisive advantage in armored combat. If a platoon could spot, range, and fire before a German tank traversed its heavier gun, the lighter Sherman could still win. The summer of 1944 became a laboratory of adaptation. As Allied forces pushed through the bocage, they encountered deadly ambushes from hidden Panthers. To counter them, commanders adopted what they called platoon concentration fire. The procedure was simple. The lead tank used its mirror periscope to range the target, relayed the distance over radio, and the entire platoon fired simultaneously. Even if the first shells bounced off, the impact dust and shock disoriented German gunners. Within seconds, one round would find a flank or hit the thinner lower plate. This tactic multiplied effectiveness exponentially. What had been 5 individual tanks became one coordinated battery. A German crew, trained to duel single opponents, found itself hit by a storm of shells from several directions. By late 1944, British and American field manuals quietly incorporated the method. The British called it split-image ranging. The Americans referred to it informally as the mirror periscope fix. Official production lines never modified Shermans with built-in rangefinders. It was a soldier's innovation, spreading by word of mouth. German reports from the Ardennes offensive later noted that Allied tanks fired with great simultaneity and precision, as if directed by one commander. The description matched the effect of the mirror-aided rangefinding and radio coordination. Statistical analysis after the war confirmed the results. When operating in platoons using coordinated fire techniques, Sherman units achieved kill ratios approaching 1-to-1 against Panthers, far better than earlier in the war when single Shermans often required 3 or 4 to down one German tank. In some engagements, notably at Aracourt in September 1944, American tank destroyers and Shermans destroyed dozens of Panthers for minimal loss, thanks to superior range estimation and communication. The irony was profound. The tool that helped achieve this was not a new gun or thicker armor, but 2 cheap mirrors and disciplined teamwork. By the end of 1944, Allied engineers recognized that improvisation could substitute for industrial limitations. The mirror trick became emblematic of the Sherman's true strength, not mechanical superiority, but adaptability. The trick that turned the tide. 1944-1945. August 1944. Normandy, France. The hedgerows had turned to graveyards for tanks. The Allies had been ashore for 2 months, and both the British and American armies had learned hard lessons. In the first weeks after D-Day, more than 1,500 Shermans had been knocked out, many by Panthers firing from ambush behind the thick, earthen-walled bocage. Allied commanders needed not just more tanks, but smarter tanks. The mirror trick, the field modification that had begun almost as a curiosity, was spreading. At first, it was the work of individual platoons. Mechanics in rear areas salvaged spare mirrors from periscopes or even from wrecked vehicles, aligning them at a shallow V angle inside the commander's sight. Crews experimented, compared notes, and discovered that at known distances, 400, 600, 800 yards, the images in the mirrors could be calibrated with marks scratched into the periscope housing. In late July, a training bulletin from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division circulated through the field. Commanders employing dual mirror ranging have shown marked increase in first-shot accuracy. Recommend adoption throughout battalion. That single line, buried in a maintenance memo, marked the informal birth of a new doctrine, one born not from a laboratory, but from necessity. The spread through the armored divisions. By September 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France, the mirror technique had become part of daily gunnery drills. The U.S. 4th and 6th Armored Divisions reported similar devices in use. In British formations, particularly the Guards Armored Division, engineers adapted the method into what they called the split image box. This was a slightly more refined version, 2 small glass prisms mounted in a box above the periscope eyepiece, providing the same parallax effect with better clarity. Crews who had once estimated range by guesswork were now logging distances with scientific precision. A Sherman gunner, once expected to fire a ranging shot before adjusting, could now open fire accurately on the first round. Reports from the front showed the results. Ammunition expenditure per target dropped by nearly 30%, and kill rates increased. The mirror trick, though never officially standardized, was beginning to make the Sherman fight above its weight. Aracourt, the proving ground. The ultimate demonstration came during the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944, near the French-German border. Here, the U.S. 4th Armored Division, under General John S. Wood, met the German 5th Panzer Army in a sprawling series of engagements across foggy hills and villages. The Germans deployed nearly 200 Panthers and Panzer IVs. The Americans had roughly the same number of Shermans, mostly 75mm models. On paper, it should have been a slaughter. Instead, it became one of the most decisive tank battles fought by the U.S. Army. Crews from the 37th Tank Battalion used a combination of tactics now standard among veteran units: rapid communication over radio, flanking maneuvers through concealment, and, crucially, coordinated ranging and fire. The fog over Lorraine forced both sides to fight at close quarters, often under 1,000 yards, the ideal environment for the mirror periscope. In many after-action reports, gunners described using the V range in the scope to set ranges quickly before the fog cleared. One platoon report noted, "Lead tank sighted Panther through haze, used V range in scope, called 600 yards. Platoon fired as one. Panther disabled before it fired." This was repeated dozens of times. Between September 19th and 29th, the 4th Armored Division destroyed or captured 285 German tanks for the loss of only 25 Shermans. Historians later debated whether superior tactics or poor German coordination was the cause, but eyewitnesses consistently credited the Sherman's ability to fire first and together. The mirror trick was no miracle device. It didn't make a 75mm gun pierce the frontal armor of a Panther, but it gave gunners precious seconds. Instead of waiting for ranging shots or for the commander to estimate by eye, they could engage immediately, often catching the Germans in the open or hitting side armor. British adaptation and the Firefly factor. While American divisions used the standard Sherman 75s and 76s, British forces were fielding a variant that would become famous, the Sherman Firefly, armed with the powerful 17-pounder gun. The Firefly could penetrate a Panther frontally, but its success still depended on first-shot accuracy. British commanders, always receptive to optical solutions, took the split-image concept further. At Lulworth Armored Gunnery School, engineers began designing an auxiliary sight called the Converging Mirror Rangefinder. Although only a few prototypes were built, the concept was nearly identical to what crews already improvised in the field. Captain Peter Bale of the 13th 18th Hussars wrote in his post-war notes, "Our troop fitted small angled mirrors inside the commander's episcopes. With a little calibration, one could judge the distance to within 50 yards, quite sufficient to drop a first round on target. We considered it as essential as our 17-pounders." By autumn 1944, British armored units crossing Belgium into the Netherlands were consistently outshooting German defenders. German reports complained that Allied tanks fired in bursts of 2 or 3 guns at once, finding the range unnaturally fast. This was the mirror method in action. Doctrine meets improvisation. What made the mirror system so powerful was not the device itself, but the doctrine that surrounded it. Allied armor doctrine now revolved around 4 key principles. First shot advantage. The side that hit first usually won. The mirror method maximized this by giving rapid range data. Platoon coordination. Tanks operated in groups of 5, firing simultaneously at one target. Flank and move. The Sherman speed and turret traverse allowed constant repositioning while maintaining aim. Communication superiority. Every Sherman had a radio. German tanks often relied on flag or hand signals. Together, these turned a mechanical disadvantage into a tactical advantage. The result was that by late 1944, U.S. and British armored units were achieving roughly parity in kill ratios with their German opponents, despite facing superior machines. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office confirmed that crew training, fire coordination, and optical ranging had a greater effect on combat success than gun caliber alone. December 1944, the Ardennes. The last major test of the mirror method came during the Battle of the Bulge. The German counteroffensive launched through the Ardennes forest in December 1944 caught Allied forces off guard. In freezing weather and limited visibility, tank engagements devolved into close-range duels. In the early days of the battle, the 3rd Armored Division fought near L'Église and Stavelot against the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, including the elite Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. Panthers prowled through snow-covered villages, ambushing columns. Sherman platoons used every trick they had. The mirror ranging system, improvised again in field conditions, proved invaluable. In after-action interviews compiled in early 1945, multiple gunners mentioned the device. One recalled, "We'd line the Panther up in the split glass, call the range, everyone fired at once. Sometimes 3-4 rounds hit him before he moved. We didn't always kill it, but he'd stop shooting long enough for our flankers to finish the job." It was not only about lethality, it was about morale. The mirror trick gave Sherman crews a sense of agency, a psychological edge against the terror of the Panther's long gun. Knowing they could estimate range and strike first, however slightly, restored confidence. As the battle bore on, Fog, snow, and exhaustion made every small advantage count. Tankers later said they trusted the mirror more than their eyes. By January 1945, the offensive had failed. German armored strength was shattered, and the surviving Shermans, battered, soot-stoned, and patched with field armor, were rolling east toward the Rhine. Technological context. To understand why the mirror trick mattered, it helps to look at the technological landscape. In 1944, optical rangefinders were large, complex, and expensive. The German EM 1.0 MR rangefinder used in Panther tanks required careful alignment and calibration. It provided excellent accuracy but was vulnerable to vibration and difficult to replace in the field. The Sherman, by contrast, relied on simplicity. The M55 periscope sight was rugged and easily replaced. By adding mirrors, crews essentially created a crude but effective stereoscopic rangefinder at a fraction of the complexity. The parallax baseline was shorter, but the human brain's ability to merge images compensated remarkably well. This field innovation was an early expression of what modern armies call distributed problem solving, adaptation from below rather than design from above. In an industrial war fought across thousands of miles, such adaptability proved decisive. The human element. It is easy to speak of mirrors and optics, but behind each periscope was a human being, a sergeant crouched in a steel turret, under fire, trusting his life to a sliver of glass. Sergeant William Croft of the 37th Tank Battalion later wrote, "We'd scrounge bits of mirror from wrecks, cut them with pliers, glue them inside the scope housing. When they aligned right, you could tell a Panther was 700 yards out just by the image. We called it the idiot's rangefinder, but it saved our hides more times than I can count." Stories like Croft's appeared in unit journals and debriefings across Europe. Not every Sherman crew used the device, and not every attempt worked. But the concept spread organically, a quiet revolution in the way ordinary soldiers reshaped their tools to survive. Strategic consequences. By early 1945, as the Allies crossed into Germany, tank combat shifted from open fields to towns and cities. Here, at close ranges under 500 yards, the mirror method was less necessary, but its doctrine, communication, coordination, concentration, remained. Post-war analyses showed that from Normandy to the Rhine, the average Allied tank platoon that used coordinated fire achieved a 50% improvement in engagement speed and a 30% improvement in hit probability on the first shot. These statistics might appear modest, but in tank warfare, seconds decide life and death. When multiplied across hundreds of engagements, the mirror trick's contribution was enormous. It did not make the Sherman invincible. Losses remained high, and crews still paid in blood for every mile. But it gave them something the enemy could not easily counter: flexibility and teamwork powered by a few ounces of reflective glass. War's end. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, thousands of Shermans stood scattered from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. Many bore field modifications, spare armor plates, sandbags, welded hooks, and often the small telltale glint of a mirror behind the periscope. Most were scrapped or given to Allied nations after the war. The mirror devices disappeared quietly, unrecorded in official blueprints. Yet the principle endured. Post-war tank designs, such as the M26 Pershing and Centurion, incorporated improved optical rangefinders and emphasized platoon coordination, ideas rooted in those field experiments of 1944. The mirror trick was, at its heart, a symbol, a piece of battlefield ingenuity that turned a mass-produced, inferior tank into a winner. It showed that in modern war, Victory does not always belong to the side with the thickest armor or biggest gun, but often to the side that can think faster. By the time the Shermans rolled through the shattered streets of Frankfurt and Cologne, they had earned a new reputation. They were no longer the Ronsons or death traps of early war myth. They were survivors, machines that adapted as their crews adapted. And all of it began with a small, simple idea: a mirror tilted at an angle, reflecting not just an image, but the ingenuity of the men who fought inside. Legacy: how a simple trick changed armored warfare forever. May 1945, Germany. The guns had fallen silent. Across the scarred landscapes of Europe, the smoking hulks of thousands of tanks, Shermans, Panthers, Tigers, stood as monuments to the most mechanized war the world had ever known. The victors now turned from fighting to understanding. Engineers, analysts, and historians began the immense task of studying what had worked, what had failed, and why. In those technical reports, one curious detail appeared again and again in U.S. and British field studies. Improvised mirror devices for range estimation increased first-hit probability and platoon coordination. It was a single line in the U.S. Army's Armored Board Evaluation number 153, dated July 1945. Few outside the Tank Corps noticed it, but within the armored warfare community, it marked a revelation. From field trick to doctrine. Post-war analysts at Fort Knox and the British School of Tank Technology examined captured German optics, rangefinders, stereoscopic sights, and gunnery computers, and compared them to Allied improvisations. They found that while the Germans possessed superior instruments, those devices were often fragile and complicated to maintain in the field. The Allied mirror trick, by contrast, had achieved 80% of the same effectiveness with almost no cost, no supply chain, and minimal training. Colonel Raymond Adams, an American ordnance officer who authored one of the early post-war reports, summarized it succinctly. The mirror range device, although crude, demonstrated that situational coordination between tanks was more decisive than individual optical superiority. A synchronized platoon of Shermans using radio and simplified ranging could defeat superior enemy armor in quantity and efficiency. This conclusion reshaped the U.S. Army's post-war training philosophy. The emphasis shifted from designing the perfect tank to building the perfect team. Birth of the modern fire control system. The most direct descendant of the wartime mirror trick was the stereoscopic rangefinder built into the next generation of tanks. The M26 Pershing, which entered combat in early 1945, already featured improved optics and a two-plane stabilized gun sight. But post-war upgrades drew heavily on the lessons of the Sherman experience. By the early 1950s, the M47 Patton introduced a formalized rangefinder housing, two optical windows on either side of the turret, joined by an internal mirror and prism assembly. The gunner aligned two images into one, exactly as Sherman crews had done with their improved periscopes. The dumb mirror trick had evolved into a professional, standardized system. The British Centurion followed a similar path. Engineers who had examined reports from Normandy built improved coincidence rangefinders into the design, noting that crew cooperation and optical alignment are the decisive factors in gunnery. Thus, what had begun as a field improvisation became the cornerstone of modern fire control systems, the integration of optics, rangefinding, and turret control to produce rapid, accurate fire. Lessons for the Cold War. As the Cold War dawned, NATO armies faced a new potential adversary, the Soviet Union. On the plains of Eastern Europe, any future war would again depend on armored maneuver. U.S. and British officers, many veterans of Normandy, carried their wartime lessons into doctrine. In 1948, the U.S. Armored School at Fort Knox added a new phrase to its gunnery curriculum: range, report, react. The idea was that every tank commander should be able to determine distance, communicate instantly, and coordinate fire, the same three elements that had defined the mirror trick. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers studied captured Shermans and German tanks alike. Their new designs, such as the T-54, emphasized low silhouettes, wide traverse rates, and integrated rangefinders. Ironically, the Red Army adopted similar tactical principles: platoon-level concentration fire and rapid ranging, which owed as much to Allied innovation as to German theory. By the mid-1950s, all major powers were incorporating coincidence or stereoscopic rangefinders into their tanks, standardizing what had once been a battlefield improvisation. Psychological impact and crew culture. Beyond technology, the mirror trick left a deeper imprint on the human culture of tank warfare. During the war, Sherman crews had lived under the shadow of inferiority. Facing Panthers and Tigers, they often felt like expendable parts in a giant machine. The mirror periscope changed that psychology. Suddenly, the crew was not helpless. They could fight smarter, not just harder. Commanders regained initiative, and platoons learned to trust coordination over individual heroism. Veterans later described this as the moment when they stopped fearing the Germans and started outthinking them. Lieutenant Harold Stokes of the 2nd Armored Division recalled in a 1972 interview, "We stopped seeing ourselves as sitting ducks. With the mirror, the radio, and the teamwork, we knew we could shoot first. That belief that we weren't helpless made all the difference." This intangible effect, morale, confidence, cohesion, became a recognized factor in post-war training. The U.S. Army even coined the term crew synergy effect to describe how coordinated teams could achieve kill ratios far beyond the sum of their equipment's specifications. From mirrors to lasers. The lineage of the mirror trick continued quietly through the decades. In the 1960s, optical rangefinders gave way to laser rangefinders, first deployed on tanks like the M60A3 and the Chieftain. Yet, the basic principle was unchanged. Two signals, in this case light pulses, were compared to calculate distance instantly. Every modern tank, from the Abrams to the Leopard 2, owes part of its fire control heritage to that first crude optical innovation. What was once a dumb mirror trick became the intellectual ancestor of one of the most sophisticated targeting systems in history. Rediscovery by historians. For decades, the mirror trick remained largely forgotten. Wartime records were sparse, and official manuals never listed it as standard equipment. Most surviving Shermans were scrapped or donated to Allied countries under post-war aid programs. Until the 1980s, military historians began piecing together the story. Researchers at the U.S. Armor Center and British historian David Fletcher of the Royal Armored Corps Museum uncovered maintenance reports and crew testimonies referencing V-range periscopes and split-image mirrors. Fletcher noted in his 1997 paper, "Improvisation in Allied Tank Warfare." In an industrial war defined by engineering, it was a small piece of glass that embodied the human capacity for adaptation. The Sherman's mirror device symbolized the triumph of ingenuity over specification. Subsequent documentaries and museum exhibits, particularly those at Bovington and Fort Benning, began including replicas of the improvised periscope, acknowledging its place in the evolution of armored warfare. Comparative studies: the Panther's downfall. The contrast with German tank design remains striking. The Panther was an engineering marvel: high-velocity gun, sloped armor, advanced optics. Yet it was also brittle, expensive, maintenance-heavy, and dependent on trained crews. The Sherman, in contrast, embodied industrial pragmatism and improvisation. Where the Panther demanded precision manufacturing, the Sherman tolerated field modification. Its open design invited adaptation: extra armor plates, sandbags, external stowage, and of course, optical modifications like the mirror periscope. In this sense, the mirror trick represented the philosophical difference between the two armies. The Germans perfected machines. The Allies perfected methods. When war turned chaotic, method survived where machines broke. A broader legacy: the power of adaptation. Historians today see the mirror trick as more than a technical curiosity. It exemplifies the principle of adaptive warfare. Modern militaries study such cases to understand how decentralized innovation arises under pressure. During the Iraq War, U.S. soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for protection, a direct echo of the Sherman crews who bolted on armor and mirrors. In Ukraine today, tankers improvise drone-mounted optics and thermal mirrors for range-finding, a digital age descendant of the same impulse. The mirror trick thus belongs to a lineage of battlefield creativity, stretching from 1944 Normandy to the 21st century. Final assessment. When post-war analysts tried to measure what made the Sherman ultimately effective, they found no single cause. It wasn't firepower, armor, or speed. It was adaptability. The tank's mechanical reliability, its radios, its ease of repair, and the initiative of its crews combined to form an ecosystem of resilience. Within that ecosystem, the mirror periscope symbolized a deeper truth: that war rewards flexibility more than perfection. General Omar Bradley, reflecting on the European campaign, said in 1948, "We won because our soldiers found ways to make do, to turn the tools they had into the tools they needed." Epilogue. At the Bovington Tank Museum in England, a preserved M4A1 Sherman stands in the corner of a dimly lit hall. On the commander's cupola, a faint glint of glass catches the light, a small, angled piece inside the periscope. Few visitors notice it, and even fewer know what it meant. That mirror, barely the size of a soldier's palm, represents one of the quiet revolutions of World War II. It was the embodiment of the Allied approach: simple, practical, cooperative, human. The Sherman never became the best tank of the war, but through that humble mirror, it became good enough to win it.